My name is Jon Savage. I'm an author, filmmaker, and professor of popular culture at Manchester University. I'm co-curator of the exhibition in the John Rylands Library, which opened last week, born in 1950.
21, really.
So, yeah, well, no, I'm afraid not. But I was 14 when homosexuality was partially decriminalized. And, growing up gay then was really no fun. And I didn't get any help from my parents, my teachers, the wider culture, society at large. And so what do you do? And I think this is common for a lot of LGBTQ people. Where do you go? And pop music was where I got basically what I needed at the time. It wasn't enough, but it was certainly, was enough for me to go on. So it starts in that, really, and obviously being a music obsessive, pop music obsessive. And in a way, it started for me being young in the 60s. I know everybody goes on about the 60s and it's become a bore, but honestly, when I was 11, I saw the Kinks doing You Really Got Me on television. And they were all wearing hunting jackets. And one of the guitarists had really, really long hair, way over the shoulder. And I thought, oh, great, they've got a girl in the group. That's really interesting. That's new. Anyway, I found out a few months later that the girl wasn't a girl, it was a boy, Dave Davis, the guitarist. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I loved all the androgyny of the 60s. So carrying it forward, really passing through my life as a young gay man. I knew older gay men when I was in my 20s and 30s they were 40 or 50, and they'd been born in the 20s and 30s, and almost to a man, very, very few examples, very, very few exemptions, sorry. They were completely fucked up by it, by the fact that it was illegal. And that made me very angry, because you had these fabulous people who were, in the most part, prevented from leading a full life because of societal prejudice. And so that's when I started to get sort of political about being gay, and particularly later on in the 80s when AIDS hit and there was a dreadful Murdoch press campaign against homosexuals. That was disgusting. And then also I talked to friends of mine, if we're going to make these distinctions, which seems a bit silly, but heterosexual friends of mine who said, look, it's not just you guys and you girls, it's us. It's all us, straights who didn't want the normal thing, who didn't want beer and football, who wanted something more glamorous, something different, something maybe even that pointed to a different way of life. And so the book comes out of all that.
Yeah.
And, and it's, after I finished the last book I did, which was a quick book about Joy Division, which I'd always wanted to do, I thought, right, it's time to tackle the big one. So I started this just around COVID lockdown, first COVID lockdown, 2020.
Period of the decriminalisation. What sort of from going through that time, what were sort of like the main themes that came out from what people who were saying, who were, as you described, on the heterosexual side, who were moving into the homosexual? How did that sort of bring itself to light?
Well, the bill itself is a very flawed piece of work, as has been pointed out endlessly in the nearly 60 years since its passing in July 1967. And it was a compromise between the people bringing the bill and incredibly fierce opposition. And, in the book, I actually I don't use too much of it because it's disgusting, but I use some of the language that the opposers to the bill used in Parliament and in the House of Lords. Yeah. And it is disgusting. It's like, well, fuck you. And so I think that there was a general move. I mean, the pop explosion of the mid-60s and early to mid-60s in the UK went hand in hand from 64 on with a liberalising Labour government. And so there was a mood in the country to kind of let things relax a bit. So I think people were moving from a position of extreme intolerance of homosexuality. The general public was moving from a position of extreme intolerance to kind of guarded tolerance. And as we know, that can flip either way, and has done several times since 1967. And I mean, you know, you do see a lot of the same tactics being used against trans people now. And having lived through it, let me tell you, it was pretty awful. First off, you had the actual fear of anybody who'd been sexually active in the years running up to that, as I was terrified of getting AIDS, because then getting HIV, sorry, and then developing AIDS, because then it was a death sentence. And it was, in fact, pretty much, very few people survived a death sentence until I think around 94, 95, when AZT came in. I was very friendly with the film director and painter and artist, Derek Jarman. And he died in February 1994. And I saw him on his deathbed, and I went to his funeral. And if he'd survived another few months, he might well have got AZT and actually still be alive now. So that was right at the tail end of the whole process. But going back, so you had the impact of actually the terror of, you know, people didn't know about it then. The science, you know, actually much as it is with COVID, was still in development and still not very clear. And at the same time, you had this hysterical campaign vilifying gay men in particular in the tabloid press, which was completely unforgivable. And so you had these two things going on, and it was absolutely brutal. And towards the end, you had Section 28, and then the government was trying to do something else. I can't remember what it was, Section 27, I think it was, or Section 5. And I was involved in a campaign, you know, going down to heaven and meeting activists like Keith Alcorn and Peter Tatchell to actually, you know, stop this thing.
And, you know, we were talking about there going down to heaven and, you know, with Peter Tatchell and other people. How did that sort of political drive come about? A real question is, how did you end up down in London?
I think everybody had enough. You can only push people. I mean, you see it everywhere. You can only push people so far, and then I think, right, that's it. You know, that's, you know, line in the sand. That's it. And, you know, I've been going to pride marches for a couple of years, in the mid 80s anyway. And I liked, I usually went, I almost always went by myself. I wasn't fully socialized as a homosexual then, but I liked the feeling of being in a large group of gay people, and basically people who hated us couldn't do anything about it. That was a good feeling. I enjoyed that feeling on the march.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the sort of the music, because the pop was, you know, is a big theme within your book. So what was the sort of defining shifting moment within pop music?
Well, there are two, really. I mean, there's Little Richard, with whom well, actually, there's several. There's Little Richard, with whom I start the book. But the big pivot, and this is, it's still a controversial thing, and I'm firmly on his side, by the way. The big event was David Bowie saying very simply, "I'm gay and I always have been." That was a complete revelation. Nobody had done that before. So Dusty Springfield had partly come out to a journalist called Ray Connolly in 1970, but it was a bit kind of vague and kind of tormented. Bowie was absolutely gleeful, having a great time, didn't appear to give a shit. And actually, you know, there have been many interpretations of it since then. The main thing that happened, apart from the interpretations, which I'll get onto in a sec, was that he was successful very successful after he made his statement. So it wasn't a career killer. So he actually started pulling in, because he was so successful and a style leader. Certainly by late 72, 73, he was pulling in all these other groups, like The Sweet in particular, to camp it up and act gay, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. It's pop music, it's not politics. And it was a great fun, I can tell you, living through it at the time. The Sweet gave great Top of the Pops. And Bowie people have questioned his sincerity, and I think that's a false question. I think, you know, he's a pop star. He's wanting to get press and attention, and make a splash. He definitely wanted to make a splash. So there's that motivation. There's being a provocateur, which he was. And also he's being honest. He had actually been through London's gay life and gay milieu since the mid-60s, when he was a young mod scuffling around Wardour Street. He'd seen it all, maybe done a bit. He had a gay manager, Ken Pitt. He had worked very closely with the mime artist, whose name was Lindsay Kemp. He had a gay style guru, Calvin. Can't remember Calvin's surname. Never mind. Anyway, he had a gay style guru who persuaded him to come down to Mr. Fish and got him to wear the dress. He'd worn the dress, the Mr. Fish dress, on the cover of Man Who Sold the World, and he did a GLF benefit in October 71. So he knew what he was talking about, and he didn't want to have to hide it. He thought, well, it's the 70s, it's been legalized, we've got gay liberation, what the hell?
Yep. But, it's always politicized by people.
It's control, it's social control, and it's simple bullying.
Yeah.
It's basically going back to the schoolyard. And if you go back to the schoolyard, who are the kids that get bullied? It's the weird ones, it's the ones that don't fit in. Mm-hmm. But, to fit in that way, you've got to subscribe to such a narrow range of human behavior. If you turn it round, there are more weird kids and kids who don't fit in, or whichever gender, than there are the normal kids,
Yeah. And sometimes when people describe normal, they want to describe it in the way that they think it behaves, rather than actually, humanity in general is all beautiful and unique.
Well, it's none of their business, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the church, unfortunately, it's often led by the church.
Yes.
And I'm not religious. I had gay friends one of my partners was religious and lost his faith because of the way that the church treated gay men. And that was devastating for him.
I'm going to move on to towards the end of the era, so sort of 1979. What do you think its legacy is of the pop industry in sort of the beginning of the 80s, end of the 70s?
Well, first off, you got disco. And disco is still now. Yeah. People still really like it. It's a euphoric form. It's at its best. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's also at its best, it's very, very gay. And I end the book with Sylvester, because Sylvester really brings all that together. And that record that he made, the one big record, I mean, he made loads of other great records, but the one big record, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, was a game changer. It was, a synth disco record. And you'd already had I Feel Love by Donna Summer, which was one of the great records of the 20th century. And this was another one, and people sat up and took notice. And then when they saw Sylvester in the video swapping genders and swapping costumes, it didn't really seem to matter, because it went with the music, which is completely euphoric and inclusive. And so you have the start at the end of the book with a National Gay and Lesbian March on Washington of an inclusive gay and lesbian politics. It's actually probably the very faint beginnings of the LGBTQ formulation, which begins in earnest later in the 80s, which has been a very successful political formulation. So I think its legacy, first off with disco, you get gay men and gay imagery thrust into the heart of the culture. It was a huge thing, particularly in America. And so you have the Village People, who Victor Willis now says it weren't gay and sues anybody who says they were. And you had Sylvester, and you had the Bee Gees taking on a gay form and making it palatable for middle-class white America in Saturday Night Fever. And Saturday Night Fever is a very interesting film, because on the surface it's quite anti-gay, because it has to erase all the gay Black and Latino elements to make it palatable for white suburbia. But there are gay things in the film. Samonti Rock is in the film. The choreographer was gay. There's slippage all over the film. So it's an interesting artifact, Saturday Night Fever, if you look at it closely. So you've got this huge visibility and affirmation at also a time when you have the rise of gay politics with people like Harvey Milk in San Francisco, and you have recognized gay districts in the big cities in America. And, you know, to an extent, this is being played out in a much smaller form in the UK. So it's a peak. And I wanted to end the book on a peak because I wanted to end on an up. Obviously, there's a huge shadow coming around the corner, which is HIV and AIDS. And I didn't want to get into that because it's too depressing. And also, by the time I got to 1979, I'd written 300,000 words. And it's not an encyclopedia, it's a book. I mean, I never regard my books as a final statement. I hope to, in my books, I always hope to open up a topic. So if somebody wanted to write a purely lesbian history of pop during that period, or even further on, that'd be fantastic. I'd really like to read it. You know, I've taken a very broad view. If somebody wanted to carry on the story through the 80s into the 90s and the 100s, that'd be fantastic as well. I'd love to read it. So, you know, there's lots more to do. There's lots more for people to do.
Yeah. So, you know, you kind of see that sort of the legacy, especially of your book, is that it's a sort of starting point for people to then tell more stories about, you know, other history and other times.
Well, that'd be great. I mean, I'm not claiming to be the first person to do it. Far from it. Quite a lot of people have been writing about this. But I just wanted to do something that was fairly thorough, and took in, you know, that 55 to 79, that's 24 years in pop culture that were incredibly fertile. So it was a lot of fun to write. I mean, it's a lot of fun to write about the 60s. It's a lot of fun to write about glam rock. It's a lot of fun to write about disco. So there was lots in there that was just really great to write about and to research.
Yeah. Right. Well, let's move on to the exhibition at John Rylands. How from the book did you come into the exhibition?
Well, I'm the professor of popular culture at Manchester University, and I work closely with the Manchester Library and John Rylands Library on a project called the British Pop Archive, which is collecting pop culture and youth culture archives. Yeah. And in the past, when I've finished books, you know, the books are often the result of a long period of amassing material and collecting, if you like. In the past, my archives have gone to John Moores University, but since I've been involved in John Rylands, they've taken in the archive of the book, which is incredibly comprehensive and has an enormous amount of stuff in it over that period between 55 and 79. There was a shortfall in an exhibition. They wanted a quick exhibition to celebrate the 125th anniversary, and basically my colleague Matt Bancroft and I basically said, we can do it. We can do it really quickly. It's fine. Matt and I have worked on a couple of shows. In the past, we worked on True Faith, which is a Joy Division New Order art exhibition at Manchester Art Gallery with Fiona Corrigan. We also worked on an exhibition in Chelsea Space in London, again about factory, the first 50 factory artifacts, so Fat Quant 50. So we're used to working together. Matt has a background in design as well as curation, and he basically did, you know, 90% of the work. And I'm very pleased with the way it looks. I think it looks fantastic. Yeah. And we talked about selection. I mean, you know, if you're doing an exhibition, you have to curate it. You just can't slap everything in there. It just doesn't work like that. So you have to have, you know, severe curation. What do we want to say? What illustrates the point? What about diversity? Who do we feature? You know, all those things come into it.
Yeah. What did you want to say with the exhibition?
Well, we carried it on into 85 because we just wanted to make it slightly different from the book, and so we carried it on into, you know, Boy George, Bronski Beat, Pet Shop Boys. We got a couple of Pet Shop Boys lyrics that have never been seen. Right. So It's a Sin and West End Girls. What do we want to say? Here's this history. These people were completely fucking great. Let's give them their due. It's still relevant today because anytime LGBTQ people get visibility and affirmation, there's always a backlash. And that is one of the themes of the book. And so there's a lot in the exhibition about gay politics. and gay persistence and resistance.
Just going to go back to the topic of resistance. How does that play out in the exhibition?
Well, we've got quite a lot of material from the gay liberation area, which is, post-Stonewall. Post-Stonewall, there was an explosion of politics and gay magazines. One of the best items, as far as I'm concerned, which is not necessarily political, but there's a magazine called Gay Power with a Robert Mapplethorpe cover from 1970, and it just looks like punk. It's amazing. And so you have a revolution in the way that gay people saw themselves, their confidence, the graphics, allying themselves really for the first time with mainstream youth culture, the hippie movement and the post-hippie movement, and what happened in those years. Because in the 60s, a lot of gay men were still into Judy Garland and not the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. I mean, the younger ones were, I talked to a couple of younger gay men who were teenagers in the 60s, and they liked, they weren't into Judy Garland. They were into kind of early soul music and Motown and Dusty Springfield and, the great record by the Janettes, Sally Go Around the Roses. So there was a younger gay aesthetic. Yeah. But the dominant one that everybody knew about was show tunes and stuff like that. So you have gay culture also aligning with a more general and wider youth culture, which I think is a very crucial moment. We've got letters from the Bangor lecturer A.E. Dyson to the Prime Minister about setting up about gay rights. He was one of the people behind the great 1960 meeting at Caxton Hall, which is one of the first big meetings where a whole lot of gay people came together and recognized themselves in this room. And so in one way, that was the start of a kind of, gay underground gay movement in the UK. So we've got that. So we've got various legal protest documents. We've even got a copy of the 1967 Sexual Offences Act. So it is grounded in that reality and also in people's resistance to continuing oppression, really, I would say.
Sort of shout number piece within inside the exhibition that's all about the future and positivity and growth and change.
I think there are pieces in the exhibition that have an emotional kick. A staff member was in the exhibition the other day, and there were a couple of younger gay men in there who'd been kicked out of their homes because they were gay. It still happens. I mean, come on. And they were looking at It's a Sin and they were crying because they'd seen the television program and they recognized elements from their own life. So, I mean, I hope that happens. I don't want people to cry, but I hope people recognize relevance to their own life. I mean, that's the most that I could ever hope for as a communicator. You want to reach other people. So what's the big takeaway from me? I really like all of it. And, there's a lot in there. I suppose I like the Mapplethorpe cover I love that bit of the exhibition where you have 4 covers of late 60s magazines, Gay and Gay Power, which are just a riot of color and hippie graphics. And I just think it's fabulous. We do have also, which is, we do have a copy of the David Bowie I'm Gay and I Always Have Been interview, which is, a major statement. You can still buy it on eBay. So, January 22nd, 1972, Melody Maker. So, we have a lot of core items. We also have, images of, drag queens, what were called then transvestites. So the subtitle of the book is How LGBTQ Performers Changed Popular Culture. And in the exhibition, there are lesbians, bisexuals, gay men, queer people, and trans women. And so that's why it's called LGBTQ, because that includes everybody who's in it.
I'm going to have to love you and leave you, but thank you so much for your time today.
Chat.
It's been a pleasure too, and I will catch up with you soon.